Well, good afternoon. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the honor of directing the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. Those of you who are sitting in the room, I expect, know the Wilson Center, but since this is also being webcast, let me simply say that the Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to President Wilson. President Wilson was a scholar long before he entered the political arena. And we at the Wilson Center try to memorialize President Wilson's twin passions of sound scholarship and good public policy. This program today is a joint enterprise sponsored not only by the Wilson Center but also by our colleagues in the National Bureau of Asian Research, based in the other Washington, in Seattle on the West Coast. I'm going to recognize Michael Wills in just a minute. He'll tell you a bit more about the National Bureau of Asian Research, as well as about a joint project that the Wilson Center and the National Bureau of Asian Research, which incidentally is known as NBR. So when you hear NBR, that's what that's all about. Michael will tell you a bit about this joint project, of which today's speaker is one component. Before we get started, however, let me simply ask you, cell phones and other electric devices play havoc with our webcast, as well as are irritating to us in this room. So we would ask you to cut off any electronic equipment you might have. Michael, I'm going to ask you to say a couple words now. Michael is the Vice President of Research and Operations at NBR. He has a background in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, also knows a great deal about China and Northeast Asia. Many of you have probably benefited from the annual series that NBR puts out called Strategic Asia. Michael has been the co-editor of many of the volumes in that series. Michael, we are welcome to be partnering once again with you and turn things over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for a very, very gracious introduction there. Let me just say a couple of words about the National Bureau of Asian Research for those of you who don't know it. We're a non-profit think tank based in Seattle, Washington, but also with a presence here just across the square in Washington, D.C. We were established 20 years ago really to fulfill the vision of Senator Henry M. Jackson from Washington State. And in many ways, our mission is similar to that of the Wilson Center. Senator Jackson believed that scholarship had a great role to play in informing the policy process. And in his career as a senator, he regularly engaged with academics who were experts in the regions he was traveling to and working on, specifically China, Russia, Japan, and using their insights to help him think through the kind of appropriate policy responses that he should be taking. NBR exists to fulfill that mission, and for 20 years we've been working to bridge the gap between the academic community and the policy community here in Washington, D.C. The new program that Bob mentioned, the National Asia Research Program, is a joint initiative that we've been engaged in for a couple of years now. And in that we're trying to really reinvigorate Asia studies in the United States. It's a long story, but I'll tell it very briefly here. The short version is, in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of support from Congress, a lot of support from private foundations to support Asia studies and the training of generations of scholars and specialists who thoroughly understood Asia and were willing to engage with the policy community. For a number of reasons, through the 70s and 80s and 90s, that trend has declined. We are now engaged in an effort with the Wilson Center and with private foundations, members of Congress, to try and reinvigorate that effort and see how we can effectively train new generations of scholars. And in many ways, Jonathan's a mentor and a model of the kind of person that we're hoping will still emerge from the academy in the years ahead. I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions about the National Asia Research Program after the event, but I'll turn this over to Bryce to introduce Jonathan.
Michael, could I ask one question before I'm introduced? I've always wondered, why is it NBR, not BAR?
Then let me beg your indulgence for another 2 minutes. NBR was set up in 1989 as the National Bureau of Asian and Soviet Research. which would be NABASA, which is an awful acronym. And our founders decided that all the leading companies and organizations tended to have three-letter acronyms. And so they, in their foresight, took the decision to shorten NBR to just to NBR, with the joke that when the Soviet Union falls, we won't have to change the name. And of course, 2 or 3 years later, that came to pass. But that's the reason why.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Michael and Bob. I'd just like to take a few moments to mention that today's event is also sponsored by the North Korea International Documentation Project, which is a project here at the center. It's really it's a fascinating project. What they do is they take old documents from the archives of the Soviet Union and North Korea's former and present allies, and translate them, collate them, and publish them so that they're accessible to all. And the coordinator of that project is James Person. I don't see him here today. And he's here at the center if anybody would like to get in touch with him. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm an Asia Program Associate here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it is my pleasure today to introduce Jonathan Pollack. He's a professor of Asian and Pacific Studies at the Naval War College. As we've heard, he's also the NBR and Wilson Center National Asia Research Program Research Associate. He has taught at Brandeis University, the Rand Graduate School of Policy Studies, UCLA, and the Naval War College. And pretty soon he'll be coming to join us in D.C. when he moves to the Brookings Institution. I believe that's next month, is it?
Yes,
December
1st. Mm-hmm.
So if you could join me in welcoming Professor Pollack.
Thank you very much. I was going back and forth on whether I would stand or sit, and for some reason I've decided to sit. So my thanks to Bob and to Michael and to Bryce, and thanks, of course, to the Asia Program and to NBR and to the North Korea International Documentation Project to help make this event possible. Today I'm going to offer some perspectives born of a great deal of research and writing and thinking over the last several years that tries to put in some context the value of various archival materials that are now available through the Wilson Center to analyze North Korea on matters central, I think, to the identity and history of the North Korean system, with a particular regard, of course, to what we euphemistically call the North Korean nuclear issue. It will not surprise you to know that I regard much of this material in conjunction with other kinds of opportunities, interviews, other careful research as really indispensable to telling a larger story. My own identity as a historically inclined political scientist and specialist on security matters underscores this a lot. There are open-ended, unresolvable debates that go on in this town all the time, many of them quite pointless, but many of them, frankly, telling us much more about the United States than they do about North Korea, which is, to be sure, a highly insular, idiosyncratic system, one that does not readily admit to understanding and disclosure, except on its own terms. And when I began much of this work, it really started very much with the kinds of standard controversies that we associate with policymaking in Washington about, quote unquote, what to do about North Korea. But that frame of reference really enlightens us much more about life inside the Beltway than it does about the Korean Peninsula. To me, this is inherently unsatisfactory and very incomplete. Again, North Korea is something of a Rorschach test. You see what you want to see. But I would think in order to put it in its larger context and framework, We both need to think historically, and we need to dig a little deeper. I should say this, that I am a China specialist. North Korea became kind of a keen interest of mine over the years, and it fascinates me now still. And even though people say it's closed, it can't be understood, I think, in fact, we understand and know much more than we realize. Granted, you have to sift through a great deal of material. You have to know when something, frankly, is fraudulent in the way of information and so forth. But I think if you work at it and are serious, you can begin to connect various kinds of dots and possibilities. A few people have influenced my work a great deal in how to think about North Korea. One of them, quite extraordinary man named Hans Moretzky, probably not known to many people in this room. Moretzky was the last East German ambassador to the DPRK, to North Korea. He knew Kim Il-sung quite well. He knew Kim Jong-il very passingly. And when early in some of my work I showed him some of my papers, or sent him some of my papers, that very much were in the currency of Washington policy debate, he looked at me and he said, you know, you Americans always think it's all about you, but it's not. Now, I've taken that advice to heart. I have tried to avoid, in almost everything that I have done over the last couple of years, an intense focus on the immediate policy questions, because I think unless we have a more grounded appreciation for where this story begins, we're never really going to get to the bottom of the story. Indeed, I'm reminded that Edgar Snow, many, many years ago, wrote a book about China called Journey to the Beginning. So to some extent, maybe this is a journey to North Korea's beginning. I should be perhaps careful in asserting any kind of comprehensive knowledge, but as I say, I think we can dig a lot deeper than to just simply base it on very much U.S.-centered accounts. I mean, to dispense with the standard policy debate very quickly, the presumption from different points of view is that one way or another the United States bears disproportionate responsibility for circumstances on the peninsula and for North Korea's retention of its nuclear weapons capabilities. The rival theories, in effect, being, and I'm oversimplifying, either because we haven't been conciliatory enough or because we haven't been tough enough. And you can fit a lot into that kind of a framework. You can, for example, say, well, you know, if only we had done X and Y and Z, we would have gotten there. Or if only we had not done X and Y and Z, we wouldn't be in the bind that we are in. The problem I have with both schools of thought is that, with the rarest of exceptions, they make no reference to, if you will, the prior nuclear history of North Korea. The first senior American official to meet with a senior North Korean official was Arnie Cantor, the recently deceased, I guess he was Undersecretary of State, Deputy Secretary of State? Under for Political Affairs, who met with Kim Jong-sun, a very influential North Korean leader, head of their international department. They met in New York in January of 1992. And it is not to say that we therefore didn't learn something about the system with which we were interacting. And that was all to the good, even if the frame of reference was not readily understandable. But to me, the problem here is that we're coming into this story awfully late. To be sure, we fought a war in Korea, although I would argue it was much more an American-Chinese war that was fought on Korean soil than it was a U.S.-North Korean war. We've interacted in Panmunjom with North Korean military figures and the like off and on for decades. We've had a continuous military presence on the peninsula, of course, since the Korean War, but very little in the way of direct access and exposure to the North. And in my judgment, we need to sort of walk it back, dig a little deeper, and see what we can learn. Why and how has the issue of North Korean nuclear weapons reached the point we now find ourselves at, and what are the possibilities and consequences? I don't want to get into the policy domain today, But what I'd really like to do is return to what we know about prior North Korean history. From its very origins as a state, and even when it was a movement, North Korea has defined its internal and its external strategies in very exceptionalist terms and very adversarial terms. It derives for some very distinctive characteristics from the fact that in many respects it is more a dynastic system than a Leninist system. Power, of course, has passed in North Korea now once, maybe now twice, from a father to a son. This is really quite unprecedented in the history of the international communist movement. It is something still of what we might call a strategic outlier in the international system. Highly distrustful of not only possible signs of opposition within the state, but in relation to any external influences. And that does not just mean the United States. That, of course, means its neighbor to the south, and historically it means both the Russians and the Chinese, and I'll talk about that. From the outset, leadership has sought to insist that its citizens envied no one, and that exclusionary strategies were there to protect North Korea from the depredations of a malign outside world. This self-perception, but it was a perception, I think, in some respects that is highly accurate, that it is a small, potentially quite vulnerable state, surrounded by more powerful and more successful neighbors that were, in the judgment of the North Korean leadership, beginning with Kim Il-sung, the founder of the state, unprepared to accord North Korea the autonomy and legitimacy to which it felt entitled. Survivalism has defined this state, even from the time, from Kim Il-sung's years in the wilderness, if you will. I don't have time today to go through all those details, but an intense distrust and set of suspicions about the outside world. At the same time, an effort to accumulate and sustain coercive power in all forms, and a very early awareness and exposure to nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. I will surmise and offer you a bit of speculation that Kim Il-sung's awareness of the nuclear revolution came very, very early, and it came before the establishment of the DPRK as a state in 1948. It really begins, frankly, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 10th, 1945, Soviet forces crossed the Tuman River 4 days after Hiroshima, 1 day after Nagasaki, and swept across the northern half of the peninsula in very quick order with minimal resistance. Kim Il-sung, of course, was the commander of what was called the Red Army's 88th Brigade, and he had planned for and prepared for and wanted to enter Korea from the west, not from the east. This, of course, would have been his first return to Korea since several years when he was there in school in the 1920s. His plans were foiled when a bridge was blown out across the Yalu that compelled him to reorient and redirect his forces through Vladivostok, enabling him to arrive on a Soviet ship in Wonsan 3 weeks later. There's only a problem. The battle, if such as it was, for the northern half of the peninsula was over by the time that Kim arrived. Victory and liberation had been secured by Soviet forces without North Korea's participation. So if we have sometimes tried to understand why have the North Koreans, Kim Il-sung and his family, been so invested in very grandiose recitations of what they did and when they did it, it begins really, frankly, with this central fact. It extends, of course, as well to questions like where was Kim Jong-il born? Indeed, even when Kim Jong-il was born. Just a bit historical fact that I've been able to determine that the North Koreans say Kim Il-sung was born in 1942. He was not. He was born in 1941, which, considering his health, is one more year doesn't help. But I have this from Soviet records, from Chinese, a Chinese scholar, and others, that if you dig, you'll find out where he was born. He was born near Khabarovsk, but certainly not on Mount Pektu on the Chinese-North Korean border. But I digress. But what was it that Kim Il-sung probably asked himself? How is it that Japan, which as a colonial power and imperial power had dominated East Asia in highly coercive fashion for much of the 20th century, how could this one American weapon or two compel Japan's abrupt, unconditional surrender after all that had transpired before? More than this, there were significant numbers of Koreans working in factories in both of these cities who died in the attacks. Add to this as well, Japan had underway in the northern half of Korea in particular major chemical and industrial facilities that contributed directly to a covert Japanese nuclear weapons effort that was underway in the 1940s. And Japan was heavily involved in mining of uranium and rare earth metals into the 1940s. More than this, in 1946 and 1947, we know from documentation in the Cold War History Project, the Soviet Union was then involved in the mining of uranium at a number of facilities in the North. Now, Kim Il-sung was never a man to think small. If these pursuits and activities were so valuable to the Soviet Union and Japan, and if these weapons had been of such singular value to the United States, why should North Korea not pursue them as well? We know, of course, also that there were early generations of Korean scientists trained in Japan in the 1930s who were subsequently involved in the program. It's possible Kim Il-sung met with some of them upon their return to the North. Even in the early 1950s, with the establishment of the National Academy of Sciences in the North, there was very active efforts underway, uranium exploration, basic research in nuclear physics, training of scientists and so forth, establishing of institutes and departments beginning in the mid-1950s. And of course, North Korea was among the charter members of the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research established in the Soviet Union in Dubna in 1956. Now, of course, this was Khrushchev's response to Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. But nevertheless, and I don't think there's any credible evidence, or I haven't seen it, that the Soviet Union was intent upon creating a possible nuclear weapon state in the North. It did seem to be something heavily for peaceful uses. But the fact is that the Russians were deeply involved, and it was an essential role that they played. There were a series of agreements that were signed, beginning two in 1956 on peaceful uses. In September of 1959, there was a joint nuclear protocol signed that opened the door to the development of the complex at Yongbyon, where, of course, North Korea has its one operative reactor. Actually, it's closed at the moment, but that's from whence the plutonium for their nuclear weapons program emanated. A whole series of steps were undertaken to establish more of an infrastructure for atomic energy research in North Korea. In 1963, the Soviet Union transferred a small research reactor to the north, located in Yongbyon. Additional facilities were built over a period of time for a variety of necessary functions as North Korea looked at its longer-term possibilities. The puzzle, in part for me, is the 1959 protocol. Even if the intent was to assist North Korea, I mean, let's remember how nuclear physics was something that was seen as the coming technology of the 1950s and into the 1960s. But the signing of this protocol, which had very operational consequences for Soviet assistance to North Korea, occurs only 3 months after Khrushchev abruptly cancels the nuclear assistance agreement with China. And I've often pondered this. It seems odd, and frankly, I've not been able to fully reconcile it in my own mind. We know that Kim Il-sung, beginning in the mid-1950s, began making initial inquiries to the Soviet Union on nuclear energy and the uses of nuclear power. And that in a series of steps, in the articulation from their seventh five-year plan in 1961, in major goals that were outlined as various party congresses, the intent was clearly to build a nuclear power industry. Now you could say, well, this is nuclear power. That was a legitimate thing to do. Kim Il-sung may have seen it as something of a talisman, something that would show that North Korea was going to be an advanced state and that it was trusted with these technologies on the part of the Soviet Union. But it nevertheless, there were other factors involved here. From an early point, there was a recognition in the North that it was lagging behind South Korea in South Korea's development. At the same time, we know from, again, various documents in the collections here that there was a feeling of Soviet betrayal of the Cubans and abiding in the Cuban Missile Crisis and abiding suspicions of what Soviet intentions towards the North would be over time. Even all of this in the aftermath of the signing of the 1961 treaty, signed both with the Soviet Union and China. In 1962, Kim Il-sung makes a fundamental commitment to full-scale militarization of the North Korean state through what were known as the four-point military guidelines. Full-scale mobilization, demands of the Soviet Union for increased military assistance, but that according to Alexander Monserov, who knows an enormous amount about these activities, Kim really controlled the program itself as it began to emerge. He did not want it specifically in military hands. But there was this open-ended fear on his part of control by the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, there is the operative question, when, if we can be precise, was a commitment made to pursue a quote-unquote nuclear weapons program? The infrastructure in a technical sense was still highly underdeveloped into the early 1960s. Now, I'm not saying that Koreans are very gifted people, gifted scientifically and otherwise, gifted in sort of a can-do spirit. It was a set of building blocks that were organized over time. But I believe, even though there are some claims that the program may have begun as early as the late 1960s, a more plausible date would be sometime in the early 1970s. What were the reasons why? I mentioned before that either envy or anxiety about South Korea. We don't know exactly when Kim Il-sung may have learned of the covert program underway in South Korea, but that may well have been a factor. At the same time, he wanted an ultimate source of power from which no one could dictate to the North, and that included the Russians and the Chinese. And last, and by no means least, he wanted something that he could bequeath to his son, much as that son is now trying to bequeath the same capability, now much more realized, to his son. So the building blocks technically begin to be put in place in the 1970s. North Korea formulates an Atomic Energy Act in 1974, and it also joins the International Atomic Energy Agency at the same time. This becomes critical. A senior North Korean nuclear scientist, Chae Hak-kun, is assigned in Vienna to the IAEA between 1975 and 1979. In that time, he does the equivalent of what we would call downloading the library. We didn't think of downloading at the time, but this is where North Korea acquires the full spectrum of designs for the two operative kinds of graphite moderated reactors. One, a British model called a Hall reactor, the other, a Marcoule reactor, French reactor, and these reflect the designs that North Korea has tried to pursue in its effort to acquire means by which it could generate plutonium for its program. The program itself, the building of the Yongbyon reactor, begins at the end of the late 1970s. By this point, the North Koreans are denying Russian scientists access to certain locations in Yongbyon, and they manage in 6 years, without any previous experience, to build a reactor that subsequently was able to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. I would note parenthetically that in the estimate of Sig Hecker, now at Stanford, in the intermittent operation of the Yongbyon reactor over about a 25-year period, it has generated the grand sum of 23 days of electricity compared to a modern reactor. Now, either that is a conspicuous failure in an area that received high priority funding over much of North Korean history, or perhaps North Korea had other purposes in mind from a very early point. So I offer you this quick excursion down memory lane to highlight that by the time the United States enters this drama, and without trivializing issues including U.S. nuclear threats during the Korean War and so forth, deployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula beginning in the late 1950s, and so forth, there is a very ample history from a very, very early point that makes me believe that it's something that is very rooted in the kind of identity of the system and of those who have led it, which simply underscores the extraordinary difficulty that, to put it mildly, that would be entailed in having North Korea forego such of a capability, even, as we may argue that it denies North Korea the opportunities to be a full participant in the international system and to try its hand at modernization. How am I doing on time?
You've still got about 15 minutes.
Oh, I did. Well, okay. Well, I don't want to. I don't want to deny the opportunities for questions. I could take the story farther along in time, but this history, much of it disclosed through the archives here, enables us to enrich and understand not only Kim's personal commitment to these activities at an early point, but also to his identity and suspicions of the outside world, including his wariness of his Chinese and his Russian partners. Nominally, of course, they were allies. Kim had a deep affinity for China, much more than for the Soviet Union. Of course, he had lived in China from the time he was a young boy, about 7 or 8 years old, and really didn't go back to Korea. Not unlike Syngman Rhee, those who emerged on top in the two Koreas did so having spent the better part of their time outside of North Korea. Syngman Rhee here in Washington, and Kim in Manchuria, and then in the Soviet Union. So my point in this is to emphasize that there is a kind of an authentic indigenous history here that stands apart from, I think, many of the usual preoccupations that we may have about the North, even as we worry, frankly, and with good reason, about things that North Korea can do and sometimes has done with the kinds of capabilities that it has. Without this kind of attention, I think we will continue to be handicapped in our understanding and unable to grasp the basis on which power has been organized and pursued in this highly unusual state. I'm going to stop there and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Okay. Standard rules for questions apply. If you could please give your name and any affiliation you might have, and we'll go up the back there. Is our microphone... Oh, Michael here will hand you a microphone. Because we're being webcast, I'll ask you to wait until it comes around. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Roy McLeod, Sydney University, Australia. Two quick questions, really. Yongbyon comes into the nuclear story, I believe, first under the Japanese, because it was the site of Japanese military research for their bomb, of course, during the war. I wonder if you found documentary evidence of the training of Korean scientists under the Japanese in 1945 as part of the Japanese war effort. Secondly, I wonder if there were any Korean scientists, in fact, interviewed by the Compton Commission, sent by the Alsos Commission, the Alsos Committee, on behalf of the United States, that would have given the Americans, if you like, some sense of where Koreans stood in relation to the nuclear project in 1945.
Those are both very good questions, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to clarify it very much. Obviously, on any kind of industrial facilities and the like, any kind of mining activities that were underway on the peninsula, I would have to assume that Korean labor was very, very extensively used in that process. At the same time, we are aware of some Korean scientists trained in Japan. Offhand, I am not aware, nor have I seen any documentation that would enlighten us about whether this was happening quite literally on the peninsula at the same time. Part of that, frankly, may have reflected the judgments about how much progress Japan had indeed made. Was it more exploratory rather than, if you will, the finishing touches? I mean, there was clearly a serious covert effort underway on the part of the Japanese, something of a race, if you will, but it was a race that they lost. So I can't really give you a clear rendering of that. I wish I could, but what I can emphasize is that Korea did play a vital role, and thank you for the reference that Yongbyon was, after all, a location where some of this activity was underway. There were a number of sites. I can't give you a total, probably 10 or more different locations that had the right conditions and the right materials that could benefit the Japanese program. So in a way, it's not an accident that when North Korea did make a commitment to building a major facility, it went back to where Japan had been before. Makes perfect sense.
Cool.
Gil Rosman, Princeton University, and Woodrow Wilson Center. There's been much discussion of how North Korea played off China and the Soviet Union, and that when one side wasn't as forthcoming, it got something from the other. Could you explain how that may have helped the nuclear program? And specifically, we know that the Chinese in the early 80s were helping Pakistan with the nuclear program, and we know that the Soviet Union, in this sort of transition into the beginning of the Gorbachev period, allowed a kind of more lenient approach to North Korea. So was there something that happened in the 80s that gave North Korea an advantage towards building its program?
Gil, very good question, and I'll try to answer it. I should have made note of the fact that Kim Il-sung and other senior North Korean officials persistently pursued the possibility for heightened assistance from the Soviet Union, in particular, periodic inquiries to the Chinese as well, well into the 1980s. And very specifically, there was a time in 83 and 4 where there was a pronounced warming of Soviet-North Korean relations, culminating in having not been able to badger Brezhnev to do this. Brezhnev had his own reasons for great suspicions and wariness towards the North. It's interesting, by the way, that no Soviet leader, that is to say, no first General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, ever set foot in North Korea. Not a one. The closest we could come to this, of course, is that Putin went there in 2000. Khrushchev was supposed to have gone there several times. We know this again from the archival records in this building, but he demurred, to say the least. We know that Brezhnev, after the Pueblo, gave a speech to the Politburo at a major party meeting, where he acknowledged that despite the suspicions of the Johnson administration that somehow the Soviet Union put up the North Koreans to this, that in fact the Russians were clueless about this. They were informed by the North Koreans. And Brezhnev said, there are things that North Korea is doing that alarm me. Those are Brezhnev's words, not mine. So there was not a lot of warm, fuzzy feeling, shall we say. But it changed under Andropov to an extent, and especially under Chernenko. Chernenko was the one who did commit in 1984 when Kim Il-sung made a major trip to the Soviet Union to provide, and again, this is something that the North Koreans had prodded for a very long time. He made a commitment for 4 Soviet light water reactors. Indeed, the site where the U.S. light water reactor program, U.S.-led consortium under Cato was to build, was the same site that the Russians had used before. But Gorbachev made it a condition of pursuing the program and fully developing the program. A condition was that North Korea had to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it did in late 1985, and the reactor contract was signed several weeks after that. Now, whether or not there was ever a serious possibility that the Soviet Union would have persisted with the reactor program is hard to know. I mean, we can speculate, but of course, with the end of the Soviet Union, that kind of went away. Certainly, there were those in the Soviet nuclear industry who would have very much wished to proceed with this kind of an activity. But as with so many things between North Korea and its benefactors, buyer beware, because they were often in default of their loan commitments, not just to the Soviet Union. On China, I'm not quite as sure, defaulting on loans to the Western Europeans. I mean, there's a long track record of that. So I don't think Brezhnev was of a mind to do this. There may have been some degree of donor fatigue here. And indeed, when the Soviet Union first recognized South Korea, and then when, of course, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, you could argue that then North Korea sought to aim higher and see if the United States would pick up the pieces of that project. Now, and of course, we can spend a lot of time on the history of that. So I think, you know, it may be that for a brief period of time in some of the latter years of the Soviet Union, less under Gorbachev, but much more under his immediate predecessors, there was a willingness to pursue these possibilities. I might note parenthetically that when Andropov died, both Kims went to the Soviet embassy to express their condolences. When Chernenko died, the same. When Brezhnev died, no one went. I might also note that when Deng Xiaoping died, Kim Jong-il did not visit the Chinese embassy. He absented himself from China for 17 years between 1983 and 2000, which reflected, I believe, a profound alienation between the Chinese and Kim Jong-il. Not Kim Il-sung, but Kim Jong-il. As for Kim Il-sung, with whom there was always a much more comfortable relationship, if not necessarily a trusting relationship with Beijing, Deng made major efforts, repeated major efforts, to encourage North Korea to think about the possibilities of policy change. In other words, emulating to some extent China's own experience. And he made very little headway on this, despite persistent efforts on his part. In 1983, Deng met with then Defense Secretary Weinberger, where Deng presented a proposal that was with North Korean concurrence for a three-way meeting between the United States, North Korea, and South Korea to be held under Chinese auspices. And I think Deng saw this as an opportunity to get some entree into the North, perhaps to encourage them in a variety of ways. And 3 weeks later, we had the Rangoon bombing, which Deng, as to my understanding, thought that Kim Jong-il was responsible for. So that's this sordid history. It suggests to me that even when the Soviets and the Chinese at different times would try to provide assistance to the North, and for a time when they competed, they were rather chagrined by the kinds of results and outcomes. So it's one thing to provide economic aid, it's one thing even to provide a certain amount of military aid. Projects related to nuclear technology and nuclear weapons are of a qualitatively different order. And I think that that was something that made both the Russians and the Chinese wary. But having said that, the Russians, North Korea would not have been able to make the headway it did if it had not been for Soviet involvement. And we can ponder that history after the fact.
Great. The gentleman here with the, yeah.
TJ Han from Seoul National University. I would like to ask, what was the reaction and understanding of North Korea? We have a well-documented evidence that General MacArthur was considering the nuclear attack on China as well as North Korea. So, was North Korea aware of such plan of the U.S. and what was their understanding and their reaction to such plan?
That's a very good question. It's my understanding that it was not until a number of years later that there was full awareness of what was, at a minimum, some consideration being given, though we could highlight that even during the Korean War, comments from President Truman and others broached this issue without it necessarily having if you will, an operational content. So the question is, did you draw a distinction between the words of senior officials as opposed to an awareness of more active planning of one kind or another? Now, I can't tell you exactly how close the United States or the U.S. Components of the U.S. military may actually have been. I'm not aware that there was ever an approval of any kind of a plan. There were certainly exercises and the like that were conducted during the 1950s. But my understanding, based on some discussions with Soviet scholars, is that it may not have been until somewhat later that Kim was fully apprised. I mean, if you think back on the history of the war, I mean, North Korea was devastated enough from American bombing campaigns during the war. I don't want to say that nuclear weapons wouldn't have made a difference. I mean, it just would have been, adding to the kind of incredible devastation. So one way or another, America was understandably the enemy. And a lot of this may very well have been one of the possible triggers to consideration of a weapons program. Remember also that when there begins to be forward movement in the program, North Korea at that point is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even as we know Soviet officials in particular during the early 1960s were actively collaborating with the United States, trying to inhibit what they knew was coming. What they knew was coming, of course, was China's development of nuclear weapons. But from some of the materials in the archives here, there was interactions between Soviet officials, the Soviet ambassador in Pyongyang at the time, and the North Korean foreign minister, where there was deep resentment on the part of the North Korean foreign minister that the Soviet Union would have the presumption to try to restrict or in effect collaborate with the United States on non-proliferation when others, China and implicitly North Korea, did not have these capabilities at that time. So there's a complex history here, which I hope the archives will continue to dig further in. But very good question.
I believe there's one right next to you, Michael.
Thank you. I'm Richard Scorza. I'm a non-aligned scholar of itinerant nature. The implication of your assessment here is that there is such a rooting of DPRK identity in its nuclear program that there's no possibility of it giving up that nuclear program, so rooted is it in its heritage with its founder. Therefore, what do you suggest the powers that be in Washington and elsewhere, I mean, there are 5 parties to a 6-party process, do about that? It seems like an unequivocal nature of the regime. So what are your suggestions?
I will have a book coming out in several months' time that will go into some detail, some things that I've left out today. Let's suffice it to say the story is more complex even than I've presented it here to be. But you're asking the question about what do we do under prevailing circumstances, and every imaginable strategy has been tried in whole or in part over the last number of years. But the fundamental reality is twofold. Number one, the United States and other powers that have signed the agreements, for example, in September 2005 in Beijing, talk about something called the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. What the United States and others mean by that is very different from what North Korea means when it talks about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. If you read and take seriously North Korean statements, which I do, basically North Korea says when nuclear weapons cease to exist in the world, then we can give them up. And when the United States no longer maintains an alliance relationship with South Korea, under those circumstances, maybe then there might be some possibilities. That's obviously not acceptable either to the United States or to South Korea. So I don't want to say, therefore, we're stuck with this problem. I mean, although we are, it does seem to me that there is probably sentiment to revisit some of these questions, but not now, for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that North Korea, in early 2009, decided to walk away from every denuclearization agreement that it had previously signed. And it's my own belief, personal opinion, that if there is ever to be a change in this circumstance, it will not be under Kim Jong-il. It will have to come from those who follow him. We don't know what his son is made of. We don't even know if his son will really, I mean, it's still a little incongruous to imagine a 27, 28-year-old 4-star general in a Confucian society really being in charge of what's going on. And I must admit he has a somewhat awkward, uncomfortable body language. At least that's my interpretation from pictures and the like that I've seen. But they're elevating him because it has to be another Kim. It cannot be otherwise. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's calling all the shots. But I think that in the long run, it's the question of whether or not, confronted by these circumstances, a future leadership of the North will be convinced that there are paths to its well-being and its longevity that do not presume a nuclear identity. That's a very tall order. I wish I could give you a more encouraging answer. So therefore, I mean, the administration has argued for strategic patience. Some will say, well, that's just playing for time, but sometimes time has some worth. It is also pursuing what I would call a policy of strategic prudence. It is, not making presumptions about these capabilities going away anytime soon. It is trying to do whatever one can to constrict the growth of these capabilities, and of course to deny any possibility that any of this could seep out of North Korea. That's not an ideal outcome, but fundamentally, the administration will not legitimate North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. I cannot imagine any American president being prepared to do that. But we do see that there are different paths and tendencies, particularly between the United States and China, which The Chinese have, despite the ups and downs, if I could call them that politely, in their relationship with the North, the Chinese have decided to elevate to a more normal relationship with North Korea, notwithstanding its nuclear weapons capabilities. They may have a different estimate of the extent of those capabilities, but more than the United States, they are prepared to live with North Korea on that basis, perhaps out of a legitimate concern about what could happen if they didn't. The six-part, I don't dwell in particularly on the six-party process for two reasons. Number one, it's been dormant for 2 years. And number two, that's a process. You do what you can. I mean, if there are other ways to skin this cat, skin it other ways. We shouldn't be obsessed about the precise mechanism and formula if we really believe there was evidence that North Korea was seriously prepared to walk away from these commitments that, as I have said, have their origins in some of the earliest years of their own state. I don't see that at this time, and that's troubling. So the others have to do what they can to make sure that this program and these activities do not have any larger destabilizing consequences either on the peninsula, in the region, or beyond. I know that's kind of a mealy-mouthed answer, but for the moment, that's the best I can do.
Okay, up the front here, Michael, I think. You're all right?
My question was just asked.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, Michael. I think Professor Pollack would probably like me to mention that his book is titled No Exit, North Korea, Nuclear Weapons and International Security, and will be published by Routledge, available at all good bookstores everywhere.
Yeah. By the way, that's totally expropriated from Jean-Paul Sartre's play, so with due credit.
There was somebody over here, I think.
Marco Di Capua, former science counselor, US Embassy in New Delhi and Beijing. Jonathan, is there any chance that actually the nuclear identity of North Korea was forged during the Korean War, in a sense that nuclear weapons being the ultimate defender of national sovereignty, when they saw their nation at risk, that there was a decision within the government of North Korea to actually move forward, accelerate, or really decide to move forward with the program, independently of the question above whether MacArthur had intended or not intended to use nuclear weapons against North Korea?
Michael, that's a very good question, and it kind of follows from the question from our Korean colleague here. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of any serious disclosure or discussions in the Korean War about nuclear-related, activities. Of course, if you think about it for the moment, even with respect to when Kim might have made a decision that this was a program to be pursued, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a documentary record of it. It easily could have been kept in a small circle. I do think that there were probably, if you will, convictions, interests that do date from the Korean War, whether it's attributable to American actions during the war or whether it is more for some of those other reasons that I identified before, that Korea really, to the degree that it could, would have preferred to stand on its own. I mean, one of the great ironies, if you will, or contradictions in North Korean behavior is North Korea aspires to a doctrine known as juche. It's loosely translated as self-reliance. It's really not self-reliance. There's nothing in the record of North Korea over the decades that they are unprepared to beg, borrow, and steal from the outside world for their own purposes, but they then control in their own determined way what they do with those kinds of things that they get. It's kind of a sense almost of entitlement. We go through multiple cycles of this, but there may have been some recognition that this was this preeminent technology. That was the dawn of the nuclear age, at least with reference to weapons, and that there may well have been a vision, if you will, long term, that one day we'll need them too. But more than that, I've bumped into a wall. I can't. I mean, again, and I'm trying to the maximum extent possible to keep what I've written not speculative, but rather based on when we can see discussions X, Y, or Z, which is, again, why the materials out of the archives here are so extraordinarily valuable. because they are much more precise, much more specific. But from the war itself, that period, I'm not aware offhand of any particular documentation. It's something that hopefully one day we'll be able to learn more about.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Jonathan, what if our worst nightmare comes true and Japan and Iran and Taiwan and South Korea go nuclear in the next decade? What does that imply for North Korea's nuclear program and for our attitude toward it?
Well, Eric, I would say, first of all, I'm not quite sure what going nuclear means.
Nuclear weapon.
Well, then that's the end of the post-war alliance system. I do not see that as a very likely outcome as long as America has judicious diplomacy and the like, and as long as, frankly, North Korea remains constrained in what it can actually build and do. I mean, I don't like the fact that they have a certain number of nuclear weapons or nuclear devices. They've never, by the way, demonstrated an ability to deliver a nuclear weapon. We don't know very much about what their, if there is a strategy, what it really looks like. But what you described there, if you're all of a sudden talking Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, everyone else, well, that's the end of any kind of an effort to sustain the non-proliferation regime as it is. And I'm not usually given one to dire forecasts of that kind. I would say that the question is always on the nth country problem. Where does the process end? Without being overly hard on previous American administrations, it's fair to note that we deemed any kind of a nuclear capability in North Korea as quote-unquote unacceptable. Well, I don't know what we mean by unacceptable, but obviously we accept the reality, the existence of these weapons. We don't like it, but we are constrained. We have, in effect, taken off the table highly coercive strategies to deal with it, barring a situation where North Korean behavior was so extreme that it left us with no other choice. But we know even from the deliberations in the early 1990s, in the first nuclear crisis, from President Kim Young-sam's memoirs. I mean, Kim Young-sam in the Republic of Korea may have been fiercely anti-North Korean, but in his conversations with Bill Clinton, he basically said to him, he says, "Don't you dare go to war. Don't do this to the Korean Peninsula. Don't do this to what we have built here." I'm paraphrasing his remarks. So, we're mindful of all of that. But you threw Iran into the mix too. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, states can pursue these options, but they keep it ambiguous. North Korea ultimately decided no longer to keep it ambiguous. Indeed, ironically, all through the period of maximal tensions with the Bush administration, if you listen to what the North Koreans were saying to us privately, what they were putting on the record, they were saying, the first time officially they claimed to have manufactured a nuclear weapon was 2005. But in exchanges with American officials several years earlier, they were saying, well, we've got them. Now, whether we believe that or not, I don't know. Did that affect our behavior? Unclear. I mean, I think that there was such an inbuilt resistance to any kind of direct negotiation with them, serious negotiation, that whether we accept them at their word or not, but ultimately, if you look to 2006, since there seemed to be a measure of skepticism, they decided to demonstrate, and they demonstrated by a not very successful initial nuclear test, and of course, within a matter of weeks, the United States and North Korea were engaged in bilateral negotiations. So there's no look. The lesson of nuclear weapons and of proliferation is that if a state is determined, no state acquires these weapons by accident. It is a function of purposive, long-term, disciplined behavior, pure and simple. That's the lesson of every case. Now, there are some reasons why we can regard North Korea as different, because after all, North Korea is the only state ever to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In other cases, Israel, India, Pakistan, they were not signatories to the NPT. I'm not arguing that that should be the fundamental litmus test, but if states have been determined to go down this path, unless there are compelling means at the disposal of others to inhibit and prevent it, it happens. I dare say that the only state on record that I am aware of that proceeded to develop nuclear weapons and we believe test a nuclear weapon and to ultimately forego those capabilities was South Africa. And that was in the context, of course, of the end of apartheid rule, and those who were exiting the political scene did not want a black majority rule to possess nuclear weapons. That, you could argue, that was in effect a regime change of a serious kind. So in that sense, could we imagine a different outcome with the North, one that would prevent that kind of a dire forecast? Well, I mean, it's something that will have to be based on the internal evolution of whatever is there in North Korea. But I would just suggest that any possibility, serious possibility of Japan and others reconsidering its options, that would have to be a function, I think, of an incredible mishandling by the United States of those relationships, which I just don't see, because we understand that that is front and center in what we seek to avoid, as long as these states can have confidence in the kind of security relationship we play with them.
I didn't mean to forecast it.
Okay.
I think we've got time for one more. This gentleman up here, Michael. Thank you.
Brent Choi from the VOA. I have two questions.
Yeah.
In 1994, there is a U.S.-North Korea agreed framework made it. Do you think what was the Kim Il-sung's intention? Just buying time, or just really has some intention to give up? Second question is that what about the 2003 U.S. invasion to Iraq? It has some impact to North Korea nuclear test?
Brent, you have asked two questions, and I'm going to be coy with you because I discussed both of them in the book. But so let me pass on the agreed framework question. I'm not trying to be a tease, but there's an interesting story there. On 2003, there is no doubt in my mind that the invasion of Iraq and the identification of of North Korea, along with Iran and Iraq as part of the so-called axis of evil, had a real effect on North Korean thinking. Kim Jong-il disappears from sight for, I think, about 3 months at this time. There's some evidence of internal war planning at the time. They may have been literally taking the United States at its word. So whatever small possibility there might have been to have North Korea forego what it did, the larger context that was then operative, I think, lent momentum, or at least a direction internally, to say we can't equivocate about this anymore. We need to go down this path. So that is if we look back on the 2002-2003 period, North Korea was very explicit about what it said it was going to do, and it did it. It disclosed much of this very, very openly. Other things were raised in the context of early diplomatic interactions in Beijing. In this sense, I think, regardless of what we may judge about North Korea as a system of rule, if you will, it's not a system that any one of us would want to live under. They are often very, very disciplined and very, very direct about what they claim their interests to be and what they expect their behavior to be. So one of the great tragedies of the early 2000 period is that maybe the Bush administration did not expect North Korea to do what it did. Maybe they didn't ask themselves what would be the implication of cutting off the supply of heavy fuel oil and the like. but they did. But we didn't really have, so far as I can determine, a plan in place, or maybe there was no expectation that they could quickly restart the extant plutonium program, regardless of what they did or did not do with respect to enrichment at the time. But those are both questions that I try to address.
Okay, actually, we do have time for one more, so let's go over to this gentleman here.
I'm Kilcheryu, the Woodrow Wilson Center Public Policy Scholar, and I'm a professor of University of North Korea Studies in Seoul. And I have some question. As maybe after your book is finished and then translate into Korean, and then maybe a bestseller will be bestseller in Korea.
Can I tell you, by the way, I'm not going to make any money off this book because I wrote this book as a U.S. government employee, so I have no larger financial stake in this. I will soon be a former U.S. government employee, but that's a different matter.
Okay. It's just kidding. And, my question is stems from the 1959. The Soviet Union is refused the Chinese asking to the nuclear technology to give them, but the 1959 is the Soviet Union and North Korea had the protocol, and I think that it might be possible as the trade as I think that not trade is a deprivation from of the Soviet Union, the uranium mine. I think the Soviet Union is deprived is an enormous amount of the uranium from North Korean soil, and so I think that that is the main reason as of the 1959, and then my comment. I was so surprised to find that praise. The North Korea nuclear science and technology antedates the establishment of the DPRK in 1948. I think it is exaggeration. So if you have any very hard evidence or documents, but I don't think you can find such documents exactly. So if your book is finished, and then maybe your book, the news of the new book can be conveyed to South Korea. Maybe the headline will be, according to Pollack, the North Korea nuclear technology science antedates is before 1948. But my thinking is the North Korean nuclear technology will be started positively is maybe 1970s. Because of the alliance, the relations of the Soviet Union and China, as you mentioned before.
We've only got a few minutes left.
Okay,
so
okay.
Could we wrap?
And so I think you don't have to emphasize the early the North Korean nuclear the technology. Yeah, thank you.
I thank you very much for your comments. I don't think we're really in disagreement. First of all, I do suggest in my book that Soviet needs on uranium may indeed have been one of the factors that does explain the 1959 agreement. It's entirely possible that it is the case. There is not a wealth of documentation that I have seen. There's almost none. It's more suggestions that people have made, about which I therefore am a bit skeptical about the very early origins. However, I would emphasize, there are many legitimate peaceful purposes, obviously, for nuclear science. And I think the DPRK at an early point sought to pursue them. But the evidence of serious consideration of a weapons program, there are some interesting hints in the 60s, but it really is in the 1970s that we really begin to see the pieces fall into place. So I don't think we're really in disagreement, although you raise a relevant point, and we all know the Korean press loves great headlines, so I don't want my meaning to be misconstrued. I will be as precise as I can be. Thank you.
And if you want to find out more about his meaning and not misconstrue it, I'll just repeat the title of that book again, even though Professor Pollack earns no money from it. It's No Exit, North Korea, Nuclear Weapons and International Security. Great. If you could join me in thanking Professor Pollack for what was a fascinating and enlightening speech. Thanks.